I've done and saying, is it worth now in that time? I'm not really using the hinge questions that people still keep coming to my blog to read about, because actually the marking linked in with the feedback that people then do based on the dot marking is more effective in that time. So in the cold light of the day, a year later, being able to weigh up what the different options are. But I, as an individual trying to change, I don't have a good solution to the personal effect there. I think if you've got colleagues who are pushing you on it, that can be helpful. Saying, did you spend your time wisely?
Thank you.
Can you help? Can you answer this at all?
I think what you're talking about there is opportunity cost, isn't it? That if you do one thing, you can't do something else.
Yeah.
And so the kind of the measurement of it is in some way so subjective as to be irrelevant. And it's kind of we're so subject to confirmation bias that if we've invested. You know, the sunk cost fallacy suggests that if we've put sufficient time into it, we will make sure we find it works, because anything else would be so hard to bear that we don't want to find that.
But it's like the Robert Coe thing, isn't it? You know, ask people how they felt about the project. Everyone who put in time is going to want to say that it was a success. Like, of course they are.
So almost the only really important thing possibly is the thinking before you do it.
And then the thinking afterwards, not immediately end, but a year down the line,
right,
where you weigh up.
Okay, yeah.
So I did another thing where I spent half a term increasing the wait time and pausing before I got response from the students. And that was quite effective and I quite liked it. But actually, when I look at it and say, is it worth me spending another half term now I've got out of the habit of doing that again properly? Probably not. It's more useful for me to improve at the moment. I'm trying to do behaviour management properly. More useful to work on that. Since I can't answer that, that's really wrong. And then act. So ways to make acting and changing effective. Piloting, not. I mean, yeah, typical thing. If you're going to put all your energy into one thing, if you do it with all your classes, you've completely committed to it. And then if it's a disaster, or if it's just complicated and difficult, then you're really in an inappropriate place with that paddle. So choosing one class and then being able to put a lot of energy and effort into that, or even maybe one lesson a week, depending on what the change is. Monitoring as you go along and dealing with student responses. So what I found, I spent a lot of time doing things that kids find weird, and students are not habituated to these things. And I've been doing this for years. So you say, okay, got you these coloured cards, don't cut up your hand when you're writing. Turn over your coloured cards and keep writing, then you can keep writing and I'll come to you at an appropriate time. They've spent 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years putting up their hand as soon as they've got a question, and I'm asking them for 2 hours a week to do something different. So I think there's a question there. Another one that I found really difficult is when I stopped giving my students grades, completely contrary to school policy. And I had to I kept having to sit out and be like, I hear what you're saying. You don't need your grade. I can talk you through the research at break time if you want. Just sit in there and accept it. But whenever I try something that they're going to find really bonkers, I do try and talk them through it in advance and talk them through what the rationale is. And actually, I find that you can usually explain that. So, for example, if it's something that's something like a hinge question where it's going to make their errors public, to talk them through like why it's helpful for me to know your errors and how I'm not judging you. I'm just trying to help us all think it through. So I think that's something else that we need to be conscious of. So again, at this point, is it working? What impact is it having? And again, with sharing learning intentions, I picked one class out of 4 that I was teaching last year in one of the 2 subjects I was teaching, and I took the sheets in every lesson and looked at it, and the first one was dire. But then I could look at it and be like, okay, this is why that was dire, and now I can tweak it, and that only worked because I was doing it in one class. Questions or reasons why this is not a good idea? Cool. And then this is the bit that loop. How do changes stick? So somewhere near the tail end, I think, then it starts to get really interesting, because we have to evaluate whether the change has worked, for which I refer you back to the thing of whatever your test method, did they know what their target was? Do they understand the point of the lesson? Working out whether that's worked. honing and making the tweaks that are going to make it actually quick and easy, because guaranteed when you bring in a change for the first time, you won't do it in the smoothest possible way. So finding a way that actually works with minimal labour costs for you. Routinising. So again, changing our shared learning intentions. I went to a point where instead of having them up on the board, I had a sheet that went to every single child, every single lesson they had to write something on. And the first time, again, that took me ages. And now it's practically as quick as when I had it on the board, and I believe slightly better. So finding a way to routinise that change and then make more time for whatever the next thing is. And related changes. So if you change one thing, that usually means a lot of other things have to change as well. So if you start finding out more about the errors students are making, you're going to have to do something about that. So it's then finding out, like, okay, so I'm now conscious that halfway through the lesson I use a hinge question and they don't understand. Actually, if I then just try and, normally I would talk through an error by discussion, but when I tried doing that, the discussion lasts to the end of the lesson and the kids are still baffled. So what's then a quick way to use the fact that they don't understand and teach around it, teach through that? Yeah, a worked example. I think I might stop and say I've talked enough, because I think I've talked you through all of these things as we've gone along. Well, if there are more questions, I'm very happy to just let's go back and say, are there any more questions at this stage about anything I've talked about so far, before I get you guys to do something? Or statements or whatever. Cool, let's assume not. So I got as many cheesy change-related pictures as I could put in, some of which are a bit horrible. And I printed you out a thing on which literally no effort was put in terms of making it look nice, but it might still be useful. So what I thought, I mean, I don't know where you're at. Some of you guys maybe are very happy with all of the things in your lesson. But if not, what I thought I'd give you is just a little sheet which focuses on what I think are the most important questions from this, and to invite you to take 6-7 minutes to talk to the people next to you, have a think, what would you most like to change? What are the options? What might the next steps be? How can you make that manageable? And then I'll get people to feedback with like, I've seen the light, I'm now going to do whatever it is. And during that time, if you've got something you want to ask, please feel free to ask that. Okay, can I interrupt there with apologies? I mean, I don't want to say this to shame people, but can you put your hand up if you talked about making a change in your classroom? Oh, that's good. Okay, well that's part of it. The one thing that I'll throw out that Jill and Chris were just talking to me about was appreciative inquiry and pointing out, as I wish I had now pointed out, you don't have to start with a problem. You could start with something good, which I'll claim that I alluded to when I talked about finding solutions. But Jill was giving some really good examples of going around and looking. So if you've got a horrible year group, finding the techniques that work with them, which different classes are using, and then sharing knowledge about that and trying to implement those instead of just beating yourself up or beating those who line manage up. So that's a nice idea. Who can share like a change that they thought were just considering might be a thing they wish to make? Hello.
Hello. We were talking about marking, weren't we? And we were talking about peer assessments. We were talking about structuring that in a really effective way, and how difficult that is to structure it in a way that's really good for pupils, and being very careful about that. And we were discussing different strategies about how to structure that in the classroom as a starting point.
So you were looking at the different options that you had.
Yeah.
Did you, in the 6 minutes you had, did you come towards any solutions? Like ideas that you thought you might have?
Well, only touching upon some of the things earlier, it was about feedback, and I'm more sceptical of peer feedback. And that's the idea it has quite an opportunity cost in setting something up, particularly in subject as English. To do it well means that you can't do something else. And wrongly, I suppose, I teach quite a lot of exam-heavy classes, and I think sometimes I spend a number of lessons trying to set something up so it becomes meaningful at the school, maybe that time would be better used in a different direction. But yeah, we're just talking about different ways of feedback and how you might hone that practice.
Who came up with reasons why they wouldn't be able to put in a change?
Well, just looking at the observation point and observing so many things that we want to try, and actually not being able to narrow down to focus on the one thing that we're going to do. Just being slightly overwhelmed by it all really.
So what matters most of all the, so what like of all the options, which ones are actually the most going to have the biggest effect, or?
And it's about evaluating, sort of looking at what's there and saying, well, what's manageable? What do I feel able to do? Is there a class that I can really work with? So actually really do put some thought into it to try and work out what it is you're then going to focus on. But actually the thing that could stop is not going through that thought process carefully enough and just feeling overwhelmed by just feeling the need to change, but not how to change. So this is the strategy. This is the framework.
Yeah, I think I once tried to change 2 things at once in my classroom, and it was a disaster because I just couldn't keep all that in my head enough to do either of them very well. So yeah, I think just picking just one thing and saying, and also giving it enough time. I think it's so easy. I've done a lot of things where I've like done that for half a time. Well, that's brilliant. And move on to the next thing. And actually, it's like the point where it's starting to work. But that's where it gets exciting to try and actually make it really good. So I think there are a few people who've blogged about, Alex Quigley, Chris Bolton, various other people, and I'm like, here are the 3 things that great teaching is. And I don't think it matters what they are, as long as they're like not totally stupid. I don't think it matters what 3 or 4 things you have, but if you pick